The morning began with a sky the color of cold steel and a river that no longer sounded like water, but like a living beast. Eleanor Hart stood at the edge of her small cabin porch holding two swaddled babies against her chest, their tiny breaths warm and uneven against her skin. She had raised them since the night they were born, found abandoned in a broken carriage near the riverbank after a stormy winter evening. The villagers had whispered that it was a curse to take in children of unknown blood. But Eleanor had ignored them. She was a widow with no children of her own and an ache in her heart that never left. These babies had filled that emptiness with their cries, their laughter, their need. Today, however, fear crept in her chest like ice because the river had risen higher than it ever had before. The rain had fallen for 3 straight days, turning gentle streams into violent currents and soft soil into mud. The old bridge downstream had collapsed during the night, and everyone knew that. When the bridge went, the river was no longer contained. Eleanor wrapped the babies tighter and stepped down from the porch, her boots sinking into wet earth. She needed to cross the river to reach the Churchill where the land was higher and safer, but the only path was along the river's edge. Yes, she walked the wind cut through her dress and carried the cries of neighbors packing what little they could carry, some shouted warnings that are telling her to wait, to leave the babies, to save herself, but Eleanor did not stop. She had made a promise the first night. She held those infants in her arms that she would never abandon them. The river came into full view then, wild brown water crashing over rocks and fallen trees, foaming and roaring with a terrifying power. The broken remains of a wagon lay half submerged near the bend. Its wheels twisted like snapped bones. Eleanor's heart pounded as memories flooded back of the night she found the babies. The same river had been swollen then too, though. Nothing like this. She remembered the sound of crying cutting through the storm and how she had followed it with a lantern shaking in her hand. That night, she had chosen love over fear, and now the river seemed determined to test that choice. The path narrowed, forcing her closer to the edge where the ground was slick and unstable. She slowed her steps, whispering soothing words to the babies, though her own voice trembled. One of the infants stirred and let out a small cry, and Eleanor kissed his damp forehead, promising softly that she would keep them safe. She could see the slope that led upward toward the hill, but between her and safety lay a stretch of ground where the river had already begun to eat away the bank. Suddenly the earth beneath her left foot gave way. She gasped and stumbled, dropping to her knees just inches from the rushing water. Mud splashed up, soaking her dress and the basket she carried the babies and tilted dangerously. Eleanor screamed, instinctively wrapping her arms around the basket and pulling it to her chest as the ground continued to crumble, that a section of the bank collapsed entirely, sliding into the river with a thunderous splash. The force of it pulled at her legs, dragging her closer to the edge. She dug her fingers into the mud, nails breaking as she fought to hold on. The babies began to cry now, loud and frightened, and that sound cut through Eleanor's terror sharper than anything. She could not let go. She could not fall. The river surged against her boots, icy and powerful, threatening to pull her in. Eleanor strained every muscle, screaming for help, though the roar of the water swallowed her voice. In her mind flashed images of the babies growing older, of first steps and first words of a life she was desperate to protect. Her arms burned, and her strength began to fail, just as another surge of water slammed in her, knocking her sideways. For a moment the world tilted, and she felt the basket slip. Her heart stopped. Time seemed to slow as she realized that if she lost her grip, even for a second, the river would take them all. With a desperate cry, Eleanor shifted her weight, throwing herself upward onto a patch of grass that had not yet collapsed. The sudden movement tore the basket from her grasp, and it slid toward the water. Eleanor lunged forward, stretching out flat on her stomach, reaching with everything she had. Her fingers brushed the rough weave of the basket just as it tipped over the edge. She caught it by the handle with one hand to strain, sending a shock of pain through her shoulder. She screamed as she pulled back inch by inch, her body pressed against the ground while the river tried to steal what she held. The babies cried louder, and Eleanor sobbed with them, her tears mixing with rain and mud. With a final surge of strength born from pure will, she dragged the basket back onto solid ground and rolled away from the edge, clutching it to her chest. She lay there gasping, her heart racing so violently she thought it might burst. The river continued to roar inches away, indifferent to her victory. Eleanor knew then that this was only the beginning. The river was rising fast, and if she stayed even a moment longer, it would claim them. She forced herself to her feet, legs shaking, and looked toward the hill again. It felt impossibly far now, but there was no other choice. She took a deep breath, held the basket tighter, and stepped forward, unaware that the greatest test of her life was still waiting ahead. Eleanor did not allow herself to rest for more than a heartbeat. She pushed up from the ground, every muscle trembling, and forced her legs to move again. The babies were still crying, their small bodies shaking inside the basket, and the sound drove her forward more surely than any fear. She adjusted the strap over her shoulder and kept walking along the narrow path, the river raging beside her like an enemy that refused to be outrun. The rain had slowed, but the damage was already done. The earth was soaked, heavy, and unstable, and with every step Eleanor felt it shift beneath her boots. She focused on the hill ahead, the church steeple barely visible through mist and spray. That place meant safety, higher ground, stronger foundations, a chance to survive. She whispered again and again that she was almost there, though she did not know if it was true. The wind rose, suddenly tearing at her dress and shawl and carrying with it a deep cracking sound. Eleanor froze just as a massive tree, uprooted by the floodwaters, broke free upstream and slammed into the bend of the river. The impact sent a surge of water crashing over the bank, flooding the path in seconds. Icy water rushed around Eleanor's legs, knocking her off balance. She cried out, stumbling sideways as the current clawed at her knees, trying to pull her down. She planted her feet and leaned forward, shielding the basket with her body. The water was so cold it burned, and she could feel it numbing her legs, stealing her strength. She took one step, then another, fighting the force of the river until she reached a patch of higher ground where the water thinned and finally retreated. She collapsed against a large rock, gasping, her chest tight with pain. The babies had gone quiet now, their cries replaced by weak whimpers, and Eleanor's heart clenched with fear. She pulled back the cloth to check them, their faces pale, their lips trembling. She rubbed their tiny hands, breathing warm air over them, whispering softly until they stirred and cried again. Relief flooding her so hard she nearly sobbed aloud. She knew she could not stop. Long exposure to the cold could kill them. She had to keep moving, even if her body begged her to rest. Yes, she pushed forward again, the path curved away from the river briefly, and Eleanor allowed herself to hope. But that hope shattered when she reached the old wooden crossing that led toward the hill. What had once been a simple narrow bridge was now half destroyed, one side torn away by the flood, leaving only slick beams and a violent rush of water below. Eleanor stared at it, her mind racing. There was no other route. The path behind her was already gone, swallowed by the river. She stood there, heart pounding, knowing that if she tried to cross and failed, there would be no second chance. She looked down at the babies, their eyes wide, and unknowing, trusting her completely. That trust settled something inside her. She stepped onto the first beam, testing it with her weight. It groaned but held. She moved slowly each step deliberate, her arms wrapped tightly around the basket. The river beneath roared so loudly it drowned out everything else, spraying her with cold mist that soaked her hair and face. Halfway across, a beam shifted beneath her foot, and Eleanor screamed, her body jerking as she nearly lost her balance. She dropped to her knees, instinctively clinging to the wood the basket pressed between her chest and the beam. She could feel the bridge vibrating under the force of the water, and she knew it could collapse at any moment. She crawled forward inch by inch, her hands slipping on the wet wood, her knees bruised and bleeding. With every movement, she prayed silently, begging for strength, for mercy, for one more chance to keep going. But a sudden crack echoed through the air, and the beam behind her snapped free, washing away into the river. Eleanor cried out in terror, realizing she could not go back. She was committed now, whether she survived or not. She forced herself upright again, swaying dangerously as she took the final steps to solid ground. When her boots finally touched earth, she collapsed forward, clutching the basket and sobbing uncontrollably. The babies cried with her, their small voices blending with the roar of the river, and for a moment Eleanor felt utterly broken. But there was no time for despair. The ground here was higher, but the water was still rising, and the wind carried distant screams and shouts from the village below. She staggered to her feet again, her body aching beyond anything she had ever known, and began the climb toward the hill. The slope was steep and slick, and several times she slipped, sliding backwards, scraping her hands and legs on stones and roots. Each time she caught herself just in time, pulling the basket close and whispering apologies to the babies as if the pain were her fault. Her lungs burned and dark spots danced at the edges of her vision. She feared she might faint, and that fear terrified her more than the river itself. If she fell unconscious, the babies would be lost. She focused on breathing on one step at a time, on the sound of their breathing, grounding her to the moment. Like a T-lash, she reached a flatter stretch of ground near a line of trees and leaned against a trunk, fighting dizziness. She looked back down toward the river and saw how far she had come and how little distance separated her from death. The river had claimed more of the land, now tearing away whole sections of the bank and carrying debris and broken pieces of homes with it. Eleanor realized then that the village might not survive this flood, even if she did. She pressed her forehead to the tree bark, closing her eyes for a brief moment, gathering what strength she had left. When she opened them, she saw movement ahead, figures struggling up the hill carrying bundles and children. The sight filled her with renewed determination. She was not alone anymore. She lifted the basket, adjusted the strap one last time, and forced her exhausted body forward, unaware that fate still had another cruel trial waiting before she could finally reach safety. The figures ahead moved slowly, burdened by fear and exhaustion, but the sight of them pulled Eleanor forward like a lifeline. She stumbled closer, her leg shaking so badly she thought they might give out at any second, but a woman carrying a child noticed her first and shouted for help, and soon hands reached out, steadying Eleanor as she nearly collapsed. The basket was taken from her arms for a moment, and panic flared until she saw the babies still safe, their chests rising and falling. She clutched the woman's sleeve, begging her not to let go, and the woman nodded, eyes filled with tears, promising softly that she would not. They urged Eleanor onward toward the church hall that stood atop the hill, its stone walls dark and solid against the storm. Every step felt heavier than the last, her vision blurring as exhaustion pressed down on her like a weight. She tasted blood where she had bitten her lip without realizing it. The wind howled around them, carrying the sound of destruction from below trees. Snapping buildings groaning and collapsing, the river roaring louder than ever. As they reached the final incline, a sharp cry rang out behind them. A young boy slipped on the mud, tumbling backward toward the slope that dropped down to the flood. Without thinking, Eleanor turned and lunged, grabbing his arm just in time. The sudden movement sent pain exploding through her already strained body, but she held on, digging her heels into the ground until others rushed to help pull the boy back to safety. He clung to her, sobbing, and she wrapped an arm around him, whispering that it was all right, though she herself was barely holding together. They urged her again to keep moving, and she nodded, forcing her legs to obey. The church doors were finally in sight when a deafening crack split the air. Eleanor looked back in horror as a massive section of the hillside below gave way, collapsing into the river in a violent rush of earth and water. The force sent a shock wave through the ground, knocking several people to their knees, including Eleanor. She fell hard, her breath knocked from her lungs, stars bursting in her vision. For a terrifying moment, she could not move, could not breathe. She thought of the babies, of how close she had come, of how cruel it would be to survive everything only to fail now. Hands grabbed her shoulders, shaking her, calling her name, though she barely heard them. She sucked in a painful breath, then another, and forced herself to sit up. The basket lay a few feet away, untouched, and relief flooded her so strong she nearly cried again. They helped her to her feet, half carrying her the remaining distance to the doors, which were thrown open by men inside, shouting for everyone to hurry. As Eleanor crossed the threshold, the sound of the storm dulled, replaced by echoes of cries, prayers, and frantic voices. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them, just as another surge of wind and rain battered the building. The church hall was crowded with villagers huddled together, soaked and shaking, Children cried, elders prayed, and everyone wore the same stunned expression of those who had narrowly escaped death. Eleanor sank to the floor, her strength finally gone. The basket was placed beside her, and she pulled it close, curling protectively around it. She checked the babies again, her hands trembling, but they were alive, their eyes blinking, their small mouths opening in weak cries. She pressed her forehead to the basket, whispering thanks over and over, tears streaming down her face. The woman who had helped her knelt beside her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders and another around the babies. They asked her name, asked where she lived, asked if she was injured, but Eleanor could barely answer, her body aching in places she did not know existed. As time passed, the storm outside continued its assault, and the building shuddered under the force. People whispered about whose homes were gone, whose family members were missing, and the words cut through Eleanor like knives. She realized that while she had been fighting for the babies, many others had been fighting for their own, and not all had succeeded. Guilt twisted in her chest, even as she held the children she had saved, and a man approached her later, his face grave, and told her that the lower part of the village had been completely destroyed, including her cabin by the river. Eleanor closed her eyes, the image of her small home flashing through her mind, the simple life she had lived there now erased. She felt strangely numb at the news, as if she had already lost everything that mattered except what lay in her arms. As night fell, candles were lit, and the hall filled with flickering light and shadows. The storm began to ease, but the river still raged below, cutting them off from the world. Eleanor sat awake long after others slept, rocking the basket, gently listening to the babies breathe. She knew her life had changed forever, that there would be no returning to what had been. She did not know where she would go or how she would rebuild, but as she looked at the two small faces staring back at her, she felt a quiet resolve settle in her heart. She had faced the river and survived for them. She would face whatever came next the same way, unaware that beyond the destruction and loss of truth about the babies awaited her one that would test her courage in ways she could never imagine. Morning arrived, slowly, pale light filtering through the high church windows, revealing the full weight of what had happened. Eleanor woke stiff and sore, her body protesting every movement. For a moment she forgot where she was then. The low murmur of voices and the smell of damp brought everything rushing back. She sat up quickly, checking the basket beside her. The babies were awake, their eyes open and alert, as if sensing the new day. She let out a shaky breath of relief and gently touched their cheeks. They were alive. They were safe. That truth grounded her more than anything else around her. People moved quietly through the hall, stepping over scattered belongings, sharing what little food had been gathered during the night. A man passed out pieces of bread and cups of warm water. Eleanor accepted some, her hands trembling as she drank. The warmth spread through her chest, easing the tight knot of fear just slightly as the morning wore on. Messengers were sent to scout the damage. When they returned, their faces told the story before their words did. The village was gone. Homes, fields, barns, even the old schoolhouse had been swallowed by the river or buried beneath mud and debris. There would be no rebuilding here, not anytime soon. A heavy silence settled over the hall, broken only by quiet sobs. Eleanor held the basket closer, feeling the babies shift and stretch. She wondered what kind of future she could offer them now that everything she owned had been taken. She had no family, no land, no savings, only her hands, her will, and two lives that depended entirely on her. Later that day, the town council gathered what survivors there were and spoke of relocation. They would travel east to a larger town that had offered shelter and work to those displaced by flood. It would be a long journey on foot through damaged roads and uncertain terrain, but staying was not an option. Eleanor listened quietly, her mind racing. She knew the journey would be dangerous, especially with the babies, but she also knew she had no choice. That night, as she tried to sleep, the pain in her body flared sharp and constant. She shifted carefully, wincing as she lay on her side. One of the babies began to cry softly, and she reached for the basket, automatically lifting him into her arms. She rocked him slowly, humming under her breath until his cries faded. She held him close. She noticed something she had not before, that a small marking on his shoulder, just below the collarbone. She leaned closer, squinting in the candlelight. A T looked like a symbol, not a birthmark she had seen before, but something deliberate, like ink faded with time. Her heart skipped. She gently checked the other baby and felt a chill run through her when she saw the same symbol in the same place, identical in every detail. Eleanor's mind raced. She remembered the broken carriage the night. She found them the fine fabrics, soaked with rain, the insignia carved into the wood, something far beyond what a poor traveler would own. She had wondered. Then, but fear and urgency had pushed the questions aside. Now, with the village gone and her future uncertain, those questions came roaring back. Who were these children really, and why had they been abandoned in the storm? She felt a sudden unease, as if unseen eyes were upon them, watching, waiting. Eleanor wrapped the babies tighter, her instincts screaming that their danger was not over. She lay awake long into the night, listening to the wind outside the church and the soft breathing of the children in. Her arms, unaware that somewhere beyond the ruined village word of the flood had already reached ears that would soon come searching for what she carried. The journey east began at dawn under a sky still heavy with clouds, though the rain had finally stopped. The survivors gathered what little they had salvaged, tying bundles with rope torn from ruined fences. Eleanor secured the basket against her body using strips of cloth so her hands would be free to balance herself on the broken roads. Every step sent pain through her bruised muscles, but she welcomed it because pain meant she was still standing, still moving forward. The babies slept fitfully, waking often to cry from the cold or hunger, and each time Eleanor stopped, no matter how tired she was, to soothe them. She fed them the last of her supplies, knowing she would have to find more soon. The road out of the valley was barely passable. Deep ruts filled with water debris scattered everywhere, and the smell of wet earth and rot hung in the air. As they walked, Eleanor noticed how often people glanced at the babies. Some looked with sympathy, others with something closer to curiosity. She kept her body turned, protectively shielding them from view. The strange marking burned in her thoughts, refusing to be forgotten. She replayed the night. She found them again and again, remembering details she had once ignored. The quality of the blanket, the silver clasp on the carriage door, the crest etched into the wood. She realized now that those details meant power, wealth, perhaps even nobility. She wondered what kind of parents would abandon children like these, and whether they were truly abandoned at all. The thought that someone might be looking for them made her stomach twist. As the day wore on, the group's slowed, exhaustion taking its toll. By midday, they reached a stretch of road that crossed open land with little cover. Eleanor felt exposed here, the sky vast above them, and the land stretching flat and empty around them. It was there that she noticed riders in the distance, dark shapes against the horizon, moving fast. A cold fear slid through her chest. She told herself it could be travelers or scouts from the eastern town, but something in her gut warned her otherwise. She adjusted the cloth around the basket and fell back toward the center of the group, keeping other people between her and the riders. The figures grew closer, their horses kicking up dirt and mud. Eleanor's heart pounded so loudly she was sure others could hear it. When the riders finally approached, they slowed, studying the group with sharp, assessing eyes. They wore dark coats marked with a symbol Eleanor recognized. Instantly, the same symbol she had seen on the baby's shoulders. Her breath caught. She felt the world narrow to that single terrifying realization. One of the riders dismounted and addressed the group, asking calm, measured questions about the flood and whether anyone had found survivors along the river. Eleanor kept her head down, her body tense, every instinct screaming danger. The man's gaze drifted over the crowd, lingering for just a second too long on the basket at her chest. She shifted subtly, turning away, pretending to adjust the cloth. The man asked if anyone had found a broken carriage during the storm. Silence fell heavy and thick. Eleanor felt sweat break out along her spine despite the cold. She knew in that moment that these men were not here to help, and that whatever future awaited the babies depended on what she did next. Her grip tightened, and she prayed that no one would answer. The silence stretched painfully long, broken only by the restless stamping of the horses' hooves. Eleanor's heart hammered so hard she feared it would give her away. She could feel the babies stir against her chest, as if sensing her fear, and she gently rocked them, keeping her face lowered. The rider's eyes moved slowly from one survivor to another, measuring, searching. A few people shook their heads, murmuring that they had seen nothing, no carriage, no survivors beyond those present. Eleanor exhaled a breath she had not realized she was holding, but the relief was short-lived. The man did not seem satisfied. He walked closer, his boots crunching against gravel and mud, and Eleanor felt his shadow fall over her. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground, praying he would move on. He stopped directly in front of her. Her hands clenched around the basket straps, so tightly her fingers ached. He asked softly what she carried. His voice was calm, almost kind, which frightened her more than anger would have. She swallowed, forcing her voice steady, and said they were her children, found after the flood, orphaned like so many others. Her words tasted like ash. The man studied her face, then glanced at the basket. The babies whimpered, and Eleanor shifted, turning slightly, as if to shield them from the wind. He reached out as though to pull back the cloth, and Eleanor's body reacted before her mind could stop it. She stepped back sharply, her foot sliding on the mud. A murmur rippled through the group at her sudden movement. The rider's eyes hardened just a fraction. He asked again, this time sharper for her to show him the children. Eleanor shook her head, clutching the basket tighter, saying they were sick and should not be disturbed. The lie hung between them, fragile and thin. For a heartbeat, she thought he might force the issue, that he would tear the basket from her arms, and everything would be lost. Then another rider called out from behind him, pointing toward the distant hills, saying they should move on that. Time was short. The man hesitated, his gaze flicking between Eleanor and the horizon. The babies began to cry louder, now thin, desperate sounds that cut through the tension. The man straightened, slowly stepping back. He said they would continue their search and warned the group to report anything they remembered when they reached the eastern town. With that, he mounted his horse, and the riders turned away, galloping off in a cloud of dust and mud. Eleanor stood frozen until they were nothing but dark specks in the distance. Her legs nearly gave out. She sank to the ground, surrounded by concerned faces, asking if she was all right. She nodded numbly, unable to explain what had just happened. As the group resumed walking, Eleanor knew with terrifying certainty that this was only a delay, not an escape. The men would return better prepared, more determined. She had seen it in the rider's eyes. The babies quieted again, their small bodies warm against her, and Eleanor pressed her cheek to the basket, fighting tears. She realized she could not take them to the eastern town as planned. If those men had power and reach, they would find her there. She needed to disappear, to go somewhere unexpected, somewhere no one would think to look. As the road stretched ahead, Eleanor made her decision. She would leave the group at the first opportunity, even if it meant facing the unknown alone. She had defied the river for these children. She would defy men just as powerful to keep them safe. Eleanor waited until dusk to slip away. The road curved into a stretch of dense woodland where the trees grew close together and the light faded quickly. The survivors slowed here, fearful of what might lurk between the trunks, and focused only on staying together. That was when Eleanor fell back, step by careful step, until the voices faded and only the sound of wind through leaves remained. Her heart pounded as she turned off the road and moved deeper into the forest, branches clawing at her dress, roots snagging her feet. She did not stop until her lungs burned and her legs shook so badly she nearly collapsed. When she finally did stop, she leaned against a tree, listening, straining for any sound of pursuit. There was nothing, only the distant call of a bird and the soft breathing of the babies. She slid down the ground and wrapped her arms around them, shaking silently with fear and relief. She knew she had just cut herself off from the last connection to safety she had known, but there was no turning back now. Night fell quickly under the canopy. The forest grew colder and darker, and every sound felt magnified. Eleanor forced herself to move again, following what little moonlight filtered through the branches. She had no map, no destination, only instinct. She headed north, away from the road, away from towns, toward land that grew rougher and less traveled. She remembered an old trapper once speaking of abandoned mining trails and forgotten settlements beyond the hills, places people no longer went. That was where she needed to go, somewhere no rider would search. Yes, she walked. Memories surfaced of her old life by the river, simple and quiet, now gone forever. She felt grief rise sharp and sudden, but she pushed it down. There would be time for mourning later if she survived. The babies stirred and cried softly, and she stopped, finding a sheltered hollow beneath a fallen tree. There she fed them the last of her food, tearing bread into small pieces soaked with water, praying it would be enough. She wrapped them in her shawl and held them close through the night, drifting in and out of sleep, every crack of twig snapping her awake. At dawn she rose stiff and aching and pushed onward. The land grew steeper, rockier, and harder to cross. She slipped more than once, scraping her hands and knees, but each time she protected the basket, first her own pain, meaningless compared to the fear of losing them. Why midday she found a narrow stream, clear and cold, and drank deeply, refilling her strength. She washed the babies' faces and whispered promises she did not know how to keep. As the day wore on, she began to notice signs of old paths half reclaimed by nature, broken posts, rusted tools, the remains of a life long abandoned. It gave her hope and dread in equal measure. She was leaving the world she knew behind, entering one that offered no guarantees. As evening approached, she reached the edge of a high ridge and looked down into a wide, hidden valley untouched by roads or farms. Smoke rose faintly from somewhere far below, proof that someone still lived there. Eleanor's heart raced. She did not know if those people would be kind or cruel, but she knew she could not survive alone much longer. She began the descent, carefully, each step deliberate, carrying not just two children, but a secret powerful enough to draw hunters across ruined lands, unaware that the choices she was making now would shape not only their lives, but the fate of everyone waiting in the valley below. The descent into the hidden valley took the rest of the day, and every step tested the last of Eleanor's strength. The slope was steep, and uneven, loose stones shifting under her boots, threatening to send her tumbling. She moved slowly, choosing each foothold with care, her body angled protectively around the basket. The air grew warmer as she descended, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The babies slept again, worn out by the constant motion, and Eleanor was grateful for the brief peace. She reached the valley floor just as the sun dipped behind the surrounding cliffs, casting long shadows across the land. What she saw made her pause. At a small settlement lay spread before her, a cluster of simple wooden homes, smoke curling from chimneys, gardens tucked close to the earth, and a river narrower and calmer than the one that had destroyed her village. It looked poor, but alive. She hesitated at the tree line, fear knotting her stomach. She had learned that appearances could be deceiving, but she had no strength left to turn back. Yes, she stepped into the open. A shout rang out that a man working near a fence straightened and stared at her, then called to others. Within moments, several people approached cautiously, their expressions wary but not hostile. Eleanor raised her free hand, showing she carried no weapon, and introduced herself, her voice hoarse. She told them she was fleeing the flood, that her home was gone, and that she needed shelter for her children. She did not mention the riders or the markings. Some of the villagers exchanged glances, and an older woman stepped forward, studying Eleanor's face and the babies with sharp, knowing eyes. She said little, only nodded and motioned for Eleanor to follow. They led her to a sturdy house near the center of the settlement, where a fire burned low and the air was warm. The woman wrapped the babies in clean blankets and pressed a bowl of broth into Eleanor's shaking hands. The taste nearly made her see why it was the first kindness she had known since the flood, and it broke something open inside her. As night settled, the villagers asked careful questions. Where had she come from? Who were the children? Did anyone follow her? Eleanor answered what she could, and what she could not she softened with half-truths. She said the children were left to her care after the storm, and that she feared powerful men might be looking for them. That was enough. The mood in the room shifted, the warmth cooling just slightly. The older woman finally spoke, saying this valley was hidden for a reason. Many of them had come here to disappear from debts, feuds, or powerful families who believed they owned people as easily as land. She said that those who stayed learned two rules. You protect the valley, and the valley protects you. Eleanor understood the weight of that promise. She nodded without hesitation, agreeing to whatever was asked of her. The woman looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once more. She told Eleanor she could stay, but secrets did not stay buried. Forever, and when they surfaced, they had a way of pulling everyone down with them. Eleanor lay awake later listening to the unfamiliar quiet broken only by the crackle of fire and distant night sounds. She held the babies close, her mind racing. She had found shelter, but not safety. The riders would not stop searching. The symbol on the baby's skin tied them to something larger, darker, and far-reaching than she had imagined. She stared into the shadows, realizing that by choosing to protect them, she had stepped into a story far bigger than her own, one that would soon force her to decide how much she was truly willing to sacrifice. Days passed, and the valley began to feel less like a hiding place and more like a fragile home. Eleanor recovered slowly, her bruises fading though the exhaustion lingered deep in her bones. She helped where she could, tending gardens, carrying water, mending clothes, always with a basket close by. The villagers watched her quietly, not unkindly, but carefully, as people who understood the cost of trust. The babies grew stronger, their cries louder, their eyes brighter, and with every small change Eleanor felt both joy and dread. She loved them fiercely, yet knew that love alone might not be enough to keep them safe. One evening, the older woman who had welcomed her came to sit beside the fire and finally spoke of the symbol. Eleanor's heart pounded as the woman traced it gently with a finger, saying she had seen it once before long. It belonged to a ruling house from the eastern cities, a family whose power reached far beyond its borders. They were known for secrecy, for eliminating threats quietly, and for never allowing bloodlines to vanish. The babies were not abandoned. They had been hidden. Eleanor felt the truth settle heavy and cold inside her. The woman said riders would keep coming and that the valley could not stay hidden forever if they did. The choice Eleanor faced was cruel and clear. She could give the children up and save the valley, or she could run again, drawing danger with her wherever she went. Eleanor spent the night awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the babies breathe. She thought of the river, the bridge, the hillside, the riders, and every moment she had chosen them over her own safety. She knew then that this was not a choice at all. She would not give them up. She would not let fear decide their fate. At dawn, she packed what little she owned and prepared to leave quietly before the valley woke. The older woman stopped her at the edge of the settlement and placed a small wrapped bundle in her hand, supplies, and a map of old routes through the mountains. She said some stories are carried by those brave enough to walk them to their end. Eleanor thanked, her tears in her eyes, and turned north once more. Yes, she climbed out of the valley. The sun rose behind her, painting the sky with fire. She did not know where the road would lead or what enemies waited ahead, but she knew who she was now. Not a widow, not a refugee, but a guardian, but a mother by choice, not by blood. She walked on, carrying two lives and a truth powerful enough to change the world, unaware that one day the story of a woman who defied a river and a kingdom would be told far beyond these mountains as a legend born from love and courage. The mountain paths were cruel and unforgiving, and Eleanor learned quickly that courage did not soften stone or shorten distance. The route marked on the old map twisted upward through narrow passes where the wind screamed like a living thing and the air grew thin and sharp. She wrapped the babies tightly against her chest, their warmth the only thing keeping her moving when her legs begged her to stop. She followed trails barely visible, etched into rock by people long gone, each step a risk of slipping into nothingness. As night fell, she sheltered in shallow caves or beneath overhanging cliffs, lighting no fire, afraid that smoke would betray her position. She slept in fragments, waking at every sound, her body permanently coiled with tension. The babies sensed the danger and cried, less as if instinct told them silence meant survival. Days blurred together, marked only by hunger, cold, and relentless forward motion. That Eleanor's supplies dwindled quickly, and she learned to chew roots, gather berries, and melt snow to survive. Her hands cracked and bled, her feet blistered and swelled, yet she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant being found. On the sixth day, she saw them again. Riders on a distant ridge, dark against the sky, moving with purpose. Her heart sank, but her resolve hardened. She veered off the marked route, trusting instinct more than the map, now descending into a maze of ravines and narrow defile, where horses could not easily follow. The terrain tore her dress and skin, but it slowed pursuit, and that was all that mattered. T1 point, she slipped and slid down a steep slope, crashing in a brush at the bottom pane, exploding through her side. She lay there gasping, certain something was broken, but when the babies cried, she forced herself upright, checking them first. They were shaken but unharmed, and that was enough. She bound her side with torn cloth and kept going. By the time she reached lower ground, the land had changed again, forests giving way to high plains. Dotted with abandoned structures, the remains of old forts and way stations from forgotten wars. There she encountered people again, not riders, but wanderers, smugglers, deserters, and families fleeing debts and laws. Eleanor kept to the edges, avoiding attention, trading labor for food and information. She learned that word of the lost heirs had spread quietly through certain circles, that rewards were promised and silence bought with gold or blood. Hearing it confirmed what she already knew. There would be no end to the hunt until the children were either reclaimed or erased. One night, as she rested in the shell that burned out, and a stranger approached, a woman scarred and sharp-eyed, who spoke Eleanor's name without being told. She said she knew who the babies were and why Eleanor ran. She said there were others like her, people who moved unseen, who believed the ruling houses had grown too powerful, too cruel. She offered protection, allies, and a plan to end the pursuit forever. Eleanor listened, wary and exhausted, weighing every word. The woman said the children carried not just a bloodline, but a truth, proof of crimes that could bring a kingdom to its knees if revealed. They were not meant to rule, they were meant to expose. She said Eleanor could keep running forever, or she could stand still once and change everything. Eleanor looked down at the babies, their small fingers curling around her own, and felt the familiar fear rise again, followed by something new, a fierce clarity. She had already crossed rivers, broken bridges, and defied death itself. She had already lost everything she once was. She realized then that survival alone was no longer enough. If the children were hunted because of what they represented, then hiding would never truly save them. She agreed to listen to the plan, not because she trusted the stranger, but because she trusted the path that had brought her here. The woman smiled grimly and said, "Then you are more dangerous than they ever imagined." As dawn approached, Eleanor stepped back onto the road, not as a fugitive, but as a bearer of purpose. She did not know if she would live to see the end of what she had chosen, but she knew this much. She would decide the story, now not the river, not the riders, not the kings. She adjusted the basket, felt the steady breathing of the children, and walked forward into a future that no longer belonged to fear. The woman led Eleanor away from the ruined inn before sunrise, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where not to be seen. They traveled along back routes and dry riverbeds, places where tracks vanished quickly and sound carried poorly. Eleanor watched her guide, closely memorizing every habit, every pause, every glance over the shoulder. Trust was a fragile thing, and Eleanor had learned it could not be given freely. The woman finally introduced herself as Mara and spoke little more than necessary. She explained that there was a network scattered across the borderlands, people who smuggled information rather than goods, and who had spent years waiting for proof strong enough to challenge the ruling houses. The babies, she said, were that proof, not because of who they might become, but because of what had been done to protect power. Their birth had been hidden witnesses, erased records burned, and when secrecy failed, the children were marked for removal. Eleanor listened in silence, her grip tightening as the truth reshaped everything she thought she knew. She was not just protecting innocent lives, she was carrying living evidence of cruelty, calculated and deliberate. The weight of that knowledge settled heavy on her shoulders, heavier than the basket ever had. They reached a concealed camp by nightfall, tucked into a fold of land where smoke dispersed and paths converged in confusing loops. There Eleanor met others, men and women of different ages, bound by shared loss and quiet anger. They did not bow or speak grand words. They offered food, water, and rest, and treated Eleanor not as a savior, but as one of them, and that steadiness calmed her more than sympathy ever could. In the days that followed, Eleanor learned the plan in fragments. They would move toward a free city far to the south, where councils still held power and records could not be erased so easily. There the truth could be presented not as rumor, but as undeniable fact carried by blood and witness. The danger was immense. The road would be watched, alliances would fracture, and betrayal was always a possibility. Eleanor asked the only question that mattered. What happens to the children after? Mara answered honestly. That would be up to the city and the people, and perhaps to the children themselves someday. Eleanor did not like that answer, but she understood it. She spent her nights awake wrestling with doubt and memory, replaying the river, the bridge, the riders, the valley, and every moment she had chosen without. Knowing the full cost, she wondered if she had the right to place the children at the center of something so dangerous. She wondered if love was enough to justify the risk, be why the seventh night the riders found them. The attack came fast, and silent arrows slicing through the dark shouts, erupting as steel met steel. Eleanor was pulled from sleep and handed the basket with a single command. Run. She did not hesitate. She ran as she always had, heart pounding, legs burning, the night tearing past her. She followed a narrow escape route lit only by moonlight, the sounds of fighting fading behind her. She did not know who lived or died. She only knew the children must survive. She reached a ravine and descended into it, sliding, stumbling, catching herself just in time. The riders appeared above moments later, silhouettes, searching, calling orders. Eleanor pressed herself into the rock, holding her breath, the babies miraculously silent. Seconds stretched into eternity before the riders moved on, believing she had fled another way. Eleanor waited long after they were gone, then climbed out, moving in the opposite direction, alone once more. By dawn, she reached a small outpost, where she found survivors from the camp, battered but alive. They told her the camp was lost, but the cause was not. Mara had escaped and sent word. The path south was still open, but time was short. Eleanor looked at the children as sunlight touched their faces and felt something steady settle inside her. She was afraid, but she was no longer uncertain. She had been shaped by fire and water and loss into something harder than fear. She nodded and said, "Then we keep moving." As they set out again, Eleanor understood that there would be no quiet ending, no return to anonymity. The story had chosen her as much as she had chosen it, and she would carry it forward not as a victim of fate, but as a challenger, step by relentless step. The road south was harsher than any Eleanor had walked before, not because of the land, but because of what she now carried inside her. The weight of responsibility pressed on her chest, heavier than fear, heavier than exhaustion. She traveled with the remaining members of the network in small, shifting groups, never staying together long enough to be traced. They moved like shadows through border towns and forgotten farmlands, avoiding main roads, sleeping in ruins, and barns always ready to scatter at the first sign of danger. Eleanor learned to read the world differently, to notice when birds went silent, when smoke rose where it should not, when eyes lingered too long. She became someone alert and sharp, forged by constant threat. The babies grew stronger each day, their cries louder, their grip firmer, and Eleanor took quiet comfort in their resilience. They did not know the danger. They carried only that when they cried, someone came, that when they reached out, someone held them. That someone was her. One night, as they rested near an abandoned watchtower, Mara found Eleanor alone, staring at the fire. She told her the free city was closer now, but the final stretch would be the most dangerous. The ruling house had allies everywhere, and desperation made men careless and brutal. They would try to seize the children openly. Now no more questions, no more shadows. Eleanor listened and nodded. She no longer felt the sharp panic that once followed such warnings. In its place was a steady calm born from too many survived moments. Mara asked her quietly if she was ready to lose everything if it came to that. Eleanor looked down at the babies sleeping against her chest and answered that she already had, and that what remained was worth more than anything she had lost. The attack came 3 days later at a river crossing just before dawn. Armed men blocked the narrow bridge, their banners unmistakable. They demanded the children by name, by bloodline, by right. Eleanor stepped forward before anyone else could speak, her body shaking not with fear, but with fury. She told them the river had already judged that blood and found it wanting. She told them they would not take these children. She did not know where the words came from, only that they were true. The fight was brutal and fast. Members of the network fell, buying time, cutting paths, breaking lines. Eleanor ran again, but this time not alone. She ran with others, forming a living shield around her. They crossed the river under fire, water splashing red. Stones slick with blood. The far bank, Eleanor slipped and went down hard, pain tearing through her side, but arms hauled her up and forced her forward. The bridge collapsed behind them, ending the pursuit, but at terrible cost. By the time they reached the hills beyond, only a handful remained. Eleanor collapsed there, shaking, sobbing, clutching the basket, as the babies cried, unharmed, unaware of how close death had come again. She looked around at the wounded and the empty spaces where others should have been, and felt grief carved deep into her heart. She understood now that this story was being written in lives, not words, and that every step forward demanded payment. As the sun rose over the hills, revealing the distant spires of the free city, Eleanor stood slowly, wiping her face. She did not feel victorious. She felt responsible. She swore silently that the lives already lost would not be wasted. She would see this through to the end, whatever that end demanded of her. She adjusted the basket, lifted her head, and began walking again toward a city that did not yet know it was about to be changed forever. The gates of the free city rose before them, tall and pale in the morning light, guarded by watchmen who looked more curious than hostile. Eleanor felt her legs tremble as they approached, not from exhaustion alone, but from the knowledge that once she crossed those gates, there would be no hiding, no turning back. The city was alive in a way she had almost forgotten: markets, stirring bells, ringing voices, echoing off stone walls. The contrast to the silence and danger of the road felt unreal. Mara stepped forward and spoke with the guards, using names and phrases Eleanor did not recognize. A moment later, they were ushered inside, quickly, quietly, as if the city itself understood the urgency of their arrival. They were taken through narrow streets to a council hall where records were kept and judgments made. The building was old, solid, and crowded with history. Eleanor stood before men and women seated in a wide circle, their faces lined with experience and suspicion. She told her story from the river to the bridge, to the riders, to the valley and the road south. She did not soften it or dramatize it. She spoke plainly of fear and choice and the children she had saved without knowing why. Yes, she finished. Mara stepped forward, presenting documents, seals, and testimony gathered by the network, proof of hidden births, erased names, and ordered killings. The final proof lay in Eleanor's arms. When the babies were shown, the mark visible on their shoulders, a hush fell over the hall. Some counselors recognized it. Immediately, others looked away as if burned by the sight. Arguments erupted, rights claimed, laws cited, threats implied. Eleanor listened, heart pounding, her grip tightening as voices rose around her. She felt small again, like the woman by the river, except now there was no escape, only endurance. At the tea last, the eldest counselor called for silence. She spoke slowly, saying power that must hide children to survive had already condemned itself. She declared the council would protect the children and investigate the crimes named openly. The ruling house would be summoned to answer, and their authority suspended until judgment. Eleanor felt a wave of dizziness at the weight of it. She had carried the truth this far, and now it belonged to the world, not just her. The children were taken gently for examination, and Eleanor's arms felt suddenly empty. She fought the urge to cry out and followed them to a quiet chamber where healers checked them carefully. She stayed close, watching every movement until finally the babies were returned to her safe and calm. That night, Eleanor was given a room for the first time since the flood, with a door that locked and a bed that did not move beneath her. She sat awake long into the night, holding the babies, listening to the city breathe beyond the walls. She felt relief, fear, and grief tangled together. She wondered what place there was for her now that her task was nearly done. She was a witness, a carrier of truth, but not a ruler, not a hero in her own eyes. Just before dawn, a messenger came telling her the council wished to see her again. Eleanor rose, quietly kissed the babies' foreheads, and prepared to face whatever came next, knowing that even here among stone walls and laws, nothing was ever truly safe, and that the final shape of this story had not yet revealed itself. The council chamber felt different this time, quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. Eleanor stepped inside, holding the babies close to their warmth, steadying her breath. The counselors were already seated, faces drawn with the strain of decisions that could not be undone. The eldest counselor spoke first, telling Eleanor that once truth is revealed, it demands witnesses who are willing to stand beside it. She explained that the ruling house had denied every accusation and accused the council of treason. They had mobilized allies, sent envoys, and quietly begun to tighten their grip beyond the city. The free city stood at a crossroads, and Eleanor now stood with it. They asked her not as a command, but as a choice to remain and testify openly. When the summons became public, T.O. placed her name and face beside the children and the evidence, knowing it would make her a target in ways running never had. The room waited. Eleanor looked down at the babies, their eyes open, calm, trusting. She thought of the river and how it had tried to take everything without asking. She thought of the people who had died, buying time, bridges collapsing, camps burning, blood soaking in a soil that remembered. She realized that every step she had taken away from fear had led her here. She lifted her head and said she would stay. The decision moved through the chamber like a breath released. Some nodded, others looked away, knowing what it would cost. Arrangements were made, quietly, guards assigned, routes planned. Eleanor was taken to a secure residence near the council hall, where days passed in tense stillness. Healers visited, checking the babies and Eleanor alike. They told her she carried an old injury that would heal slowly and that she must rest, but rest came poorly. Sleep brought dreams of water and hooves and hands reaching for what was hers. Outside, the city shifted. People whispered, markets buzzed with rumor, and notices were posted calling for an open hearing. The ruling house arrived not with humility, but with spectacled banners, armor, escorts meant to intimidate. They denied everything, calling the children imposters, the marks forgeries, the witnesses traitors. The city held its breath. On the day of the hearing, the hall overflowed. Eleanor stood before the assembly, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might drown her words. She told her story again, slower this time, naming places and moments, speaking of fear and choice, and the simple truth that she had acted because leaving children to die was unthinkable. She did not claim virtue. She claimed responsibility. Mara and others testified, documents were read, seals verified, witnesses called. When the children were brought forward, a murmur swept the room. Some wept, some turned away. The ruling house representatives argued fiercely, but cracks showed, contradictions surfaced, lies tangled over time. As the sun dipped low, the council withdrew to deliberate. The wait stretched endless. Eleanor sat holding the babies, whispering to them that whatever happened, she would not let go. When the council returned, the eldest spoke, declaring the charges proven, the crimes real, and the authority of the ruling house dissolved pending judgment. She ordered the arrest of its envoys and protection for the children under the law of the free city. A roar erupted, cheers, cries, fury, all at once. Eleanor felt her knees weaken, relief crashing over her like a wave. She sank down, clutching the babies, tears finally free. That night the city did not sleep. Some celebrated, others prepared for retaliation. Eleanor sat by a window, watching torchlight flicker through streets, knowing this was not an ending, but a turning. The river had pushed her onto this path, and now she stood at its widening mouth where currents split and choices multiplied. She did not know what the world would look like tomorrow, only that she would face it awake, holding fast to the lives that had changed her, and a truth that once carried could never be set down again. The days that followed were restless and sharp-edged, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Eleanor remained under protection, but protection did not bring peace. Messages arrived hourly, some hopeful, some threatening, warning of armies gathering and alliances shifting beyond the walls. The ruling house had not accepted the judgment quietly. They called it rebellion and promised consequences. Eleanor felt the weight of those words settle into her bones, yet she did not regret her choice. She spent her time caring for the babies, learning their rhythms, their smiles, their quiet strength. They laughed, now soft sounds that startled her each time, as if joy were something fragile she feared to trust. The council met constantly, and Eleanor was summoned, often not as a symbol, but as a voice. They asked her what should be done with the children, how openly they should be seen, how much truth the city should reveal at once. She answered honestly that hiding had only fed the cruelty that openness carried risk, but also power. The truth she had carried survived because it was protected by silence and movement, but it would only end the hunt if it stood in the light. The council listened, and slowly the city began to change. Public records were opened, decrees posted, and messengers sent to neighboring cities carrying copies of the evidence. The story spread not as rumor, but as fact, and with it came anger and fear and something like hope. People gathered outside the council hall holding candles, demanding accountability not just for the children, but for all the disappearances long whispered about. The ruling house responded with force. Blockades formed roads, closed trade threatened. Eleanor watched from the walls as distant banners appeared on the horizon, reminders that power rarely yields without blood. Mara came to her one evening, saying the network was preparing for the worst evacuation route, supplies hidden, allies alerted. She asked Eleanor if she was ready to leave if the city fell. Eleanor looked at the babies asleep in her arms and shook her head. She said she had run far enough. This time she would stand, not because she was fearless, but because fear had already taken too much. The first clash came without warning, that a skirmish at the southern gate, alarms ringing, steel flashing, chaos erupting through the streets. Eleanor was rushed to safety, clutching the children as the city fought to hold its ground. The sounds of battle echoed through stone and bone, alike hours stretched, until finally the noise faded. The city held, but at a cost. Mourners filled the squares, and Eleanor walked among them, offering what comfort she could, knowing each loss was tied in some way to the truth she had helped unleash. Guilt returned heavy and familiar, but she did not let it break her. She remembered the river, how it destroyed without malice, and how survival demanded movement, not denial. In the quiet that followed, the council made a final decision. They would not return the children to any throne. They would grant them protection not as heirs, but as citizens free from claim, and Eleanor would be recognized as their guardian under the highest law. Eleanor felt her breath catch at the word guardian, named what she had become through choice and sacrifice. When the decree was read aloud, she stood holding the children as the city witnessed it, not as a spectacle, but as a promise. That night, Eleanor stood on the walls looking out at the dark, uncertain land beyond. She knew danger remained, that enemies would not vanish simply because a law had been written. But she also knew something irreversible had happened. Power had been challenged openly and survived. The river had tried to end her story and failed, and so had kings. She turned back toward the city lights, toward the lives now bound to hers, and stepped forward into a future still unwritten, but finally chosen. Years later, the river was still spoken of, but no longer with fear alone. People told the story of the flood as the moment everything changed, not just for a village or a woman, but for a world that learned power could be confronted by ordinary courage. Eleanor stood on a stone bridge in the free city, watching calm water move beneath her, the babies, now children, at her side, their laughter echoing across the arches. They had grown strong, curious, and kind, raised not as symbols or heirs, but as people, taught the weight of truth and the cost of choice. The marks on their shoulders had faded with time, no longer a threat, but a reminder of what had been survived. The ruling house had fallen, fractured by exposure and resistance, and other cities had followed the example, choosing councils over crown secrecy, overthrown by record and witness. Eleanor never sought recognition and refused every title offered. She lived simply near the river, teaching, helping, listening, carrying forward the quiet strength that had saved her before. Some nights she still dreamed of rushing water and hose in the dark, but the fear no longer ruled her. She had learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move anyway. The children knew her not as a hero, but as their mother, the one who stayed, the one who chose them every time. When they asked about the past, she told them the truth without embellishment of storms and roads and people who helped and people who try to harm. She told them that the world changes when someone refuses to look away. As the sun set over the city, Eleanor rested her hands on the stone, feeling its steady strength and the steady presence of the lives beside her. She knew the story would be told in many ways, some grand, some flawed, but its heart would remain simple, A woman saw children in danger and did not turn away. That choice carried her across rivers through fire into a future reshaped by truth. She watched the water flow free and unthreatening and smiled knowing that while stories in life continues shaped by those brave enough to stand when standing seems impossible. And in that knowing Eleanor found peace.